You are listening to When We Collide. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara. Akumah Audiobooks. Chapter 1, A Fateful Encounter. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Lena Walker curled her fingers around the warm ceramic mug, inhaling the bittersweet scent before taking a careful sip. She exhaled slowly, her body sinking into the cozy embrace of the worn-out armchair by the window. The soft hum of chatter and the occasional clatter of cups against saucers created a symphony of comfort around her, the kind of background noise that made solitude feel less lonely. Outside, the late autumn sky hung low, a dull gray stretching over New York City like an unfinished painting. The streets bustled with people wrapped in thick scarves and woolen coats, their breaths curling in the crisp air. The world moved forward, as it always did, but for once, Lena was content to stay still, anchored in this small cafe on the corner of 53rd and Lexington. She turned her attention back to the book resting on her lap, tracing the edges of the pages absent-mindedly. She had been meaning to read it for weeks, but her mind had been too restless lately, preoccupied with work, deadlines, and the gnawing feeling that something in her life was missing. Lena? She blinked at the sound of her name, a voice that couldn't be real. Her breath hitched as she lifted her gaze. And there he was. Elliot Carter. Her fingers tightened around the book, her heart slamming against her ribs as she stared at the man she hadn't seen in 5 years. The man who had vanished from her life without a word, leaving nothing but unanswered questions and the wreckage of a love she had tried so hard to forget. He stood a few feet away, holding a coffee cup in one hand and a sketchbook in the other, his grip firm as if grounding himself. His dark brown hair was slightly longer than she remembered, falling over his forehead in tousled waves, and his sharp blue eyes, ones that had once held so much warmth, now carried something else. Hesitation. Lena felt the sharp sting of memories rush back like an open wound exposed to the cold. Elliot started, but before he could say another word, a loud crash startled them both. A waitress had tripped, sending a tray of coffee cups tumbling through the air. And in a moment of reflex, Elliot moved. The next few seconds unfolded in slow motion. Lena barely had time to react before hot liquid splashed across her coat, the scent of espresso filling her nose. She gasped at the sudden heat, flinching as Elliot cursed under his breath, setting his cup and sketchbook down before grabbing a handful of napkins. "Shit, I'm so sorry," the waitress mumbled, rushing to clean the mess. "It's fine," Lena muttered, brushing at the dark stain spreading across her coat. Elliot hesitated before handing her a napkin. "Here." She stared at his outstretched hand for a beat too long before snatching the napkin from his grasp. "I can handle it." Silence hung between them, thick and unspoken. Lena's hands trembled slightly as she dabbed at her coat, her mind whirling with too many emotions. She had spent years convincing herself that Elliot was a ghost from her past, that she had buried him in a place she would never revisit. And yet, here he was, standing inches away, as if the universe had decided she needed a reminder of everything she had tried to leave behind. Elliot shifted on his feet, glancing toward the empty chair across from her. "Can I sit?" Lena wanted to say no. She wanted to tell him to leave, to walk away just as he had 5 years ago. But instead, she found herself nodding stiffly, betraying the part of her that still needed answers. He settled into the seat, placing his sketchbook on the table. For a moment, he simply looked at her, as if trying to memorize every detail of her face. "You look different," he finally said. Lena scoffed. "And you look exactly the same." A small, humorless smile ghosted across his lips. "I doubt that." She folded her arms, her guard snapping into place. "What do you want, Elliot?" His jaw tightened. "I didn't expect to run into you." "That makes 2 of us." Another silence. The weight of their history loomed between them, unspoken but suffocating. Elliot exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, Lena, he paused, as if the words were too difficult to say. "I know I owe you an explanation." Lena's throat tightened, but she kept her expression unreadable. "You owe me a hell of a lot more than that." He flinched slightly, his fingers clenching against the table. "I know." She studied him, searching for something, regret, guilt, anything to tell her that he had spent the past 5 years feeling even a fraction of the pain he had left her with. "Why now?" she asked, her voice quieter. "After all this time?" Elliot hesitated. He looked down at his hands, as if the answer was written in the lines of his palm. "Because I never stopped thinking about you." Lena's breath caught. A part of her wanted to believe him. Another part, the one that had spent sleepless nights wondering why she hadn't been enough for him to stay, wanted to walk away. She swallowed hard. "That's not good enough." Elliot nodded slowly, as if expecting that response. "I know." The cafe around them buzzed with life, people laughing, conversations flowing, the scent of cinnamon and coffee lingering in the air. But for Lena, the world had shrunk down to this moment, to the man sitting across from her, to the past that refused to stay buried. She looked at him, really looked at him. He seemed different. There was something in his eyes, a heaviness he hadn't carried before. "Are you sick?" she asked suddenly, the thought slipping out before she could stop it. Elliot's breath hitched, and for the first time, he looked away. And that was all the confirmation she needed. Lena watched as Elliot looked away, his fingers curling into a fist against the table. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken truths, and she could feel the walls around her heart harden. So he was sick. She had thought of every possible reason why he had disappeared, fear of commitment, loss of feelings, maybe even another woman, but never this. "How long?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. Elliot exhaled sharply, his gaze still fixed on the tabletop. "I was diagnosed 5 years ago. Right before I left." Lena's heart clenched. 5 years. That meant he had already known when they were together, had already made the decision to leave while she had been completely unaware. Her hands tightened in her lap. "And you thought the best way to handle it was to disappear? To let me believe I wasn't worth an explanation?" Elliot finally looked up. His blue eyes, once so familiar and full of warmth, now carried a weight she couldn't quite decipher. "It wasn't about you, Lena." She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "That's the worst part, Elliot. It was never about me, was it? It was your decision, your choice, your burden to carry alone. Did you ever think about what it did to me?" He flinched, and for the first time, she saw guilt crack through his carefully guarded expression. "I thought I was protecting you." "From what?" she snapped. "From loving someone who was sick? From possibly losing you? You didn't even give me a chance to decide, Elliot. You just left." The cafe's warmth suddenly felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. Lena could hear the chatter around them, the clinking of coffee cups, the distant hum of a jazz tune playing through the speakers. But in this moment, it all faded into the background. Elliot dragged a hand through his hair. "I was scared, Lena. I didn't know how to handle it. The doctors told me my condition was serious, that I might not have long. I thought walking away was the best thing I could do for you." Lena's chest tightened. "And now? Why are you here now?" Elliot hesitated, his fingers tracing absent patterns on the table. "Because I got better. Or at least, better than they expected. The treatments worked, but it's not gone. It never really goes away." Lena stared at him, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and something she refused to name. "So now that you're better, you think you can just come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Like nothing ever happened?" Elliot shook his head. "No. I know I can't undo what I did. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But when I saw you just now, I couldn't walk away again." Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She wanted to hate him. God, she wanted to hate him so badly. But the truth was, she had never been able to. Instead, she had spent years burying the pain, telling herself she had moved on, convincing herself that she no longer cared. But here he was, sitting across from her, and every feeling she had locked away was pushing against the surface, demanding to be felt. She turned her gaze toward the window, watching as raindrops began to dot the glass. "I spent months waiting for you to come back," she murmured. "I kept thinking maybe you got cold feet, maybe you needed space. And then when it became clear you weren't coming back, I hated myself for still wanting you to." Elliot's expression crumpled. "Lena." She held up a hand, stopping him. "No. You don't get to say anything right now. Just listen." He swallowed hard and nodded. "I went through hell trying to move on. I told myself 1,000 times that you were just a part of my past. But the truth is, Elliot, you broke me. And I don't know if I can ever put those pieces back together with you in my life again." A silence stretched between them, thick with history and pain. Elliot nodded slowly. "I understand." Lena studied him, searching for the selfish boy she had once loved, the one who had made decisions for both of them without asking. But he wasn't that boy anymore. There was something different about him now, something raw, something regretful. She wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she also wasn't ready to walk away. Not this time. Lena inhaled deeply and reached for her coat. "I need to go." Elliot's face fell slightly, but he didn't argue. "Okay." She stood, gripping the fabric of her coat like a lifeline. For a brief moment, she hesitated, then looked at him one last time. "If you really want to talk, meet me at the park tomorrow at 6, she said, her voice softer now. "If you don't show up, I'll know you were never really ready." Elliot's eyes searched hers, as if trying to understand what she was offering him. A chance. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just a chance. "I'll be there," he said, his voice steady. Lena nodded once, then turned and walked out of the cafe, stepping into the cold drizzle of the evening. She didn't know if she was making a mistake. But for the first time in years, she was willing to find out. Akumah Audiobooks. You are listening to When We Collide. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara. Akumah Audiobooks. Chapter 2: The Weight of the Past. The steady hum of the city surrounded Lena as she walked through Central Park, the crisp autumn air nipping at her cheeks. She pulled her coat tighter around her, her fingers curling around the edges as if that alone could protect her from the storm of emotions raging inside her. She shouldn't have asked him to meet her. She should have walked out of that cafe and never looked back. And yet, here she was. Her boots crunched against the fallen leaves as she made her way toward the secluded bench near the lake, the place she and Elliot had once claimed as theirs. It was strange how memories clung to places, how something as simple as a bench could hold so much weight. She glanced at her watch. 5:58 p.m. He would come. She didn't know why she was so sure of it, but she was. And then, as if pulled from a memory, she saw him. Elliot stood a few feet away, hands shoved into the pockets of his coat, his gaze locked onto hers. He looked different in the fading daylight, softer somehow, but there was still something restless in his posture, like he wasn't sure if he had the right to be here. Lena swallowed the lump in her throat and turned toward the bench, sitting down without a word. After a moment, Elliot followed, settling onto the other side, leaving a careful space between them. Silence stretched between them, thick and uncertain. Lena exhaled, watching as her breath curled in the cool air. "You came." "I told you I would," Elliot said quietly. She turned her head slightly, studying him. "You didn't seem too reliable last time." Elliot winced, but he didn't argue. Instead, he shifted, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, but I need you to know, leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done." Lena let out a short, humorless laugh. "Funny. From where I was standing, it looked pretty easy for you." Elliot flinched, his fingers tightening. "It wasn't," he murmured. Lena let the silence hang between them before finally asking, "How bad was it?" Elliot sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Bad. The doctors said my condition was unpredictable. I had to go through months of treatments, surgeries. Some days, I thought I wouldn't wake up the next morning." Lena's stomach twisted. She had spent years hating him for leaving, but she had never imagined the pain he had been carrying alone. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice was quiet now, the anger giving way to something more fragile. Elliot let out a shaky breath. "Because I couldn't bear the thought of you watching me fall apart." Lena turned to face him fully. "And you thought disappearing was better? Do you have any idea what that did to me?" His eyes met hers, filled with regret. "I do now. But back then, I thought I was doing the right thing." She looked away, staring at the lake. The surface rippled gently, reflecting the city lights in a way that felt almost poetic, calm on the surface, chaos beneath. "You were always like that," she murmured. "Thinking you had to carry everything on your own." Elliot was silent for a long moment before he said, "And you were always the one who wanted to carry it with me." Lena closed her eyes briefly. The truth of that statement settled deep in her chest, reopening wounds she wasn't sure had ever really healed. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. Elliot's brows furrowed. "Regret what?" "Leaving," she said, turning to face him. "Do you regret walking away?" Elliot's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Every single day." Lena's breath hitched. She hadn't expected that answer to hit so hard, hadn't realized how much she had been bracing for something else, some excuse, some justification. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot hesitated before answering. "Because I got a second chance at life. And the first thing I realized was that I'd thrown away the best thing in mine." Lena's chest ached. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him it wasn't that simple, that love didn't just pick up where it left off. But beneath the anger was something else. A tiny flicker of something she had sworn she would never let herself feel again. Hope. She looked away, shaking her head as she tried to steady her breath. "Elliot, I don't know if I can do this." "I'm not asking you to," he said quickly. I just wanted you to know the truth. You deserve that much." Lena exhaled, her mind a tangled mess of past and present. She had spent years wondering why he had left, torturing herself with what-ifs. And now, for the first time, she had the answer. But knowing the truth didn't erase the pain. Lena stood up, wrapping her coat tighter around her. "I need time," she said finally. Elliot nodded, his gaze filled with understanding. "I'll wait." She hesitated for just a second before turning and walking away, leaving him sitting on the bench, staring after her. And as she disappeared into the night, she realized something. For the first time in years, she wasn't walking away with unanswered questions. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Lena walked aimlessly through the city streets, the cool night air biting at her skin. Her conversation with Elliot played on repeat in her mind, each word unraveling a different emotion: anger, sadness, confusion, and something she refused to acknowledge just yet. Why now? Why did he get to come back after all this time and tell her that he regretted leaving? That he had been sick? That he had tried to protect her by making a decision she never agreed to? She hated that a part of her still cared. She hated that, despite everything, she had sat on that bench with him, listening to his story instead of walking away. Lena exhaled sharply, blinking against the city lights. She needed clarity, something to ground her before she spiraled into a mess of emotions she had spent years suppressing. And there was only one place she could go. The small bookstore on the corner of 5th and Maple was Lena's safe haven. The familiar scent of old pages and freshly brewed coffee washed over her the moment she stepped inside, and for the first time all evening, she felt like she could breathe. "Well, if it isn't my favorite heartbroken bookworm," a voice teased from behind the counter. Lena turned to see Sophie, her best friend and the owner of Maple and Company, leaning against the register with a knowing smirk. Lena rolled her eyes. "I'm not heartbroken." Sophie arched an eyebrow. "You only ever show up here this late when you need an emergency session." "Spill." Lena sighed, running a hand through her hair before dropping into one of the armchairs near the window. Sophie grabbed 2 mugs of coffee and plopped down beside her, sliding one across the table. Lena stared into the cup, gathering her thoughts before finally speaking. "Elliot's back." The teasing glint in Sophie's eyes disappeared in an instant. "Wait, Elliot? As in vanished into thin air and left you broken, Elliot?" Lena nodded. Sophie swore under her breath, setting her coffee down. "Where? How? And more importantly, why?" Lena took a sip of her coffee, the warmth soothing her nerves. "I ran into him at the Bean. We talked. He told me he was sick. That's why he left." Sophie's expression softened, but her arms remained crossed. "Sick? Like, how sick?" Lena let out a slow breath. "Cancer. He was diagnosed 5 years ago, and the prognosis wasn't good. He thought he was protecting me by leaving." Sophie muttered something that sounded like idiot men under her breath before shaking her head. "Okay, so he was sick. I get that. But that still doesn't excuse him disappearing without a word." "He didn't even try to tell you?" Lena shook her head. "No. He thought it was better that way." Sophie leaned back, letting out a humorless laugh. God, the audacity of men. They act like they're in some tragic romance novel where they get to make all the decisions and suffer in silence. Lena gave her a small smile.
"Yeah."
"Well, that's Elliot for you." Sophie studied her carefully. "And how do you feel about all this?" Lena hesitated. That was the problem. She didn't know. "I thought I hated him," she admitted. "I spent years convincing myself that I had moved on, that I was better off. But tonight, sitting across from him, hearing everything he had gone through, I don't know. It's like the anger is still there, but it's tangled up with old feelings?" Sophie finished gently. Lena swallowed hard and nodded. Sophie exhaled, reaching over to squeeze Lena's hand. "Listen, you don't owe him anything. Not your forgiveness, not your time, not your sympathy. But if there's even the smallest part of you that wants to hear him out, then that's your choice." Lena chewed on her lip. "I told him I needed time." "And what did he say?" "He said he'd wait." Sophie snorted. Damn right he will. After everything, the least he can do is wait. Lena huffed out a small laugh, appreciating Sophie's unwavering loyalty. They sat in silence for a moment before Sophie nudged her. So, are you gonna see him again? Lena hesitated before answering. I don't know. And that was the truth. The past still lingers. Lena barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Elliot from 5 years ago, with his lazy grin and the way he used to tuck a strand of her hair behind her ear. Elliot from last night, with his regret-filled eyes and the way his voice broke when he said he regretted leaving. By the time her alarm buzzed, Lena was exhausted, but she forced herself to push through her morning routine. As she left her apartment, she had every intention of burying herself in work, of pretending last night hadn't happened. But fate had other plans. She was halfway down the street when she spotted him. Elliot stood near the coffee cart by her office building, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for her. Her heart stuttered. He looked different in the daylight, less like a ghost from her past and more like someone real, someone she had once loved. And maybe, deep down, someone she still did. Lena could have turned around. She could have ignored him, let him stay in the past where he belonged. But instead, she took a breath and walked toward him.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to When We Collide. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 3, Unfinished Conversations. Lena hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. The city buzzed around her, horns honking, people weaving through the streets, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of roasted coffee and fresh bagels. But at that moment, none of it mattered. The only thing she could focus on was the man standing a few feet away. Elliot. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon. Last night, she had left things uncertain, unsure if she wanted to open the door he had so suddenly reappeared through. And yet, here he was, standing by the coffee cart, scanning the crowd, looking like he was searching for something, or someone. Before she could overthink it, Lena cleared her throat. Elliot. His head snapped up, eyes locking onto hers instantly. A flicker of something, relief, crossed his face before he straightened. Lena. They stood there for a moment, caught between past and present, between words left unspoken and new ones waiting to be said. Lena gestured toward the coffee cart. Are you stalking me now, or is this just a coincidence? Elliot huffed out a small laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. I'd like to say coincidence, but honestly, I was hoping I'd see you again. She folded her arms, trying to ignore the way her heart skipped a beat. Why? Elliot sighed, shifting his weight. Because I didn't like how we left things. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but if there's even the slightest part of you that's willing to hear me out, I want to try. Lena studied him, searching for insincerity, but found none. Coffee, he asked, motioning to the cart. She hesitated. If she said yes, it meant giving him another moment, another chance to explain himself. If she said no, she could walk away and keep things in the past, where maybe they belonged. Against her better judgment, she sighed. Fine. But only because I haven't had my caffeine yet. A small, almost hesitant smile appeared on Elliot's face, and for a split second, she saw the boy she had once loved. They ordered their drinks, black coffee for him, caramel macchiato for her. As soon as they had their cups, Elliot motioned toward a nearby bench. Do you have time to sit? Lena checked her watch. She had 15 minutes before she needed to be in the office. That was enough time to listen. Okay, she said, sitting down. Elliot took the spot beside her, careful to leave space between them. The silence stretched between them as the city moved around them, a stark contrast to the stillness of their conversation. Finally, Lena broke the silence. "So, what do you want to say?" Elliot exhaled slowly, staring down at his coffee cup. "I know that apologizing doesn't change the past. And I know that explaining why I left doesn't erase the pain I caused you." He looked at her then, his gaze steady. "But I need you to know that leaving wasn't easy for me. It broke me just as much as it broke you." Lena clenched her fingers around her cup. "Then why did you do it?" "Because I was scared," he admitted. "I didn't want you to see me like that, weak, broken. I thought if I left, I could spare you the pain of watching me fade away." Lena let out a bitter laugh. "And instead, you left me with a different kind of pain. One that lasted for 5 years. Elliot flinched. "I know. And I hate myself for it. But Lena, I didn't think I'd make it. I thought I was protecting you." She shook her head, a mix of frustration and sadness bubbling in her chest. "You don't get to decide that for me. You don't get to make those choices alone and expect me to be okay with them." "I know," he said softly. Silence. Lena stared at her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "So, what now?" Elliot exhaled. "That's up to you." She looked at him then, really looked at him. He was different, older, more worn, but still Elliot. Still the boy she had loved. The boy who had shattered her. Lena wasn't sure if she could forgive him. But she also wasn't sure if she wanted to walk away just yet. Before she could decide, her phone buzzed. A reminder flashed across the screen, meeting in 10 minutes. She sighed, standing up. "I have to go." Elliot nodded, standing as well. "Can I see you again?" Lena hesitated, then nodded once. "Maybe." His lips pressed together, but there was something hopeful in his gaze. "Okay." She turned to leave but paused after a few steps. Glancing back, she met his eyes. "Elliot, if we do this, if we even try to talk again, you have to understand something." He straightened. "What?" "I'm not the same girl you left behind," she said. "And you don't get to come back into my life and expect things to go back to how they were." Elliot swallowed hard but nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything else." Lena held his gaze for a moment longer before finally turning away, disappearing into the city crowd. And as she walked, she realized something. She wasn't ready to forgive him. But she also wasn't ready to let him go. Lena barely made it to her office on time. She rushed through the lobby, nodding absent-mindedly at the receptionist before stepping into the elevator. The moment the doors slid shut, she let out a slow breath, pressing the button for the 18th floor. Her mind was still tangled with thoughts of Elliot. She hadn't expected to see him today, hadn't expected to let herself talk to him again. And yet, she had. The rational part of her screamed that she should have walked away, that she shouldn't let him back in so easily. But another part, the part that still remembered the way he used to hold her, the way he used to look at her like she was the center of his world, wasn't ready to shut the door completely. The elevator dinged, snapping her out of her thoughts. Lena straightened her blazer and stepped into the bustling office of Grant and Whitmore Publishing, where she worked as an assistant editor. She wove through the rows of desks, trying to shake off the emotional haze lingering from her conversation with Elliot. "Lena." She turned to see Noah, her coworker and best friend at work, leaning against her desk with his arms crossed. His dark brown eyes scanned her face, immediately picking up on something. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, tilting his head. "Bad morning?" Lena sighed, setting her coffee down. More like a morning I wasn't prepared for. Noah quirked an eyebrow. I'm listening. Lena hesitated, then motioned for him to follow her into one of the empty conference rooms. As soon as the door shut, she leaned against the table, arms crossed. It's Elliot, she said quietly. Noah's entire expression shifted. His usual easygoing demeanor hardened, and his jaw tensed. He came back? She nodded. Last night. And then I ran into him again this morning. Noah scoffed, running a hand through his hair. Let me guess. He gave you some tragic excuse for disappearing? Lena frowned. It wasn't an excuse, Noah. He was sick. Cancer. Noah blinked, whatever retort he had dying on his lips. Wait, he said slowly. What? Lena exhaled. That's why he left. He didn't want me to see him like that, didn't think he would make it. He thought he was protecting me. Noah was silent for a moment before shaking his head. So, what? He just gets to show up 5 years later and expect you to listen? He doesn't expect anything, Lena said, though even she wasn't sure how true that was. He just wanted me to know the truth. Noah let out a humorless laugh. The truth? You mean the truth he conveniently left out for half a decade? Lena rubbed her temples, frustration bubbling in her chest. I'm not saying what he did was okay. I know it wasn't. But it's not as black and white as we thought. Noah studied her carefully, then let out a sigh. What are you going to do? Lena hesitated. I don't know. And that was the problem. A night of confessions. By the time Lena left work, the weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders. She needed a drink. Sophie didn't even ask questions when Lena texted her, just sent a location and a "see you in 10." Lena arrived at the Lantern, a cozy bar just a few blocks from her apartment, to find Sophie already seated in a booth, 2 margaritas in front of her. You looked like you needed something strong, Sophie said, pushing a glass toward her. Lena took a grateful sip before sinking into the seat. You have no idea. Sophie studied her. I take it today didn't help you sort through your Elliot problem? Lena groaned, setting her glass down. If anything, it made things worse. Sophie arched an eyebrow. Worse how? Noah knows now, Lena said. And he's pissed. Sophie let out a low whistle. Yikes. Can't say I blame him, though. Lena shot her a look. You're supposed to be on my side. I am, Sophie said. But Noah's always been protective of you. After what Elliot did, he's not just going to accept that the guy gets a redemption arc. Lena sighed, swirling her drink. I don't even know if I accept it. Sophie leaned forward. Lena, be honest with me. Do you still have feelings for him? Lena's stomach twisted. Did she? She wanted to say no. She wanted to tell Sophie that she was completely over Elliot, that the past was just that, the past. But when she thought about the way his voice had cracked when he told her he regretted leaving, or the way his eyes softened when he looked at her this morning, she wasn't so sure. I don't know, Lena admitted. It's complicated. Sophie gave her a knowing look. That sounds like a yes. Lena groaned, resting her forehead against the table. I hate that you're right. Sophie chuckled, but then her tone turned serious. Look, I get it. Love doesn't just disappear. But you need to be careful. Elliot may be back, but that doesn't mean everything he broke can just magically fix itself. I know, Lena said, sitting up. But if there's even a small chance that we could. She stopped herself. Could what? Pick up where they left off? Start over? Find closure? She wasn't sure. And that terrified her. A message that changes everything. Lena got home around midnight, exhausted but still wide awake. She kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto her couch, debating whether she should distract herself with a book or just accept that her brain wasn't going to shut off tonight. Her phone buzzed. She frowned, reaching for it. When she saw the name on the screen, her breath caught. Elliot. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she finally opened the message. Elliot, I know I should probably give you space, but there's something I never told you. Something I should have said back then. Can I see you tomorrow? Lena's heart pounded. Something he never told her? What else could there possibly be? Her fingers trembled as she typed a response. Lena, where? His reply was almost instant. Elliot, the bridge. 8 p.m. Lena stared at the message. The bridge. The place where they had spent so many nights together, whispering dreams into the wind, making promises they never got to keep. Was she really ready for this? She didn't know. But she did know one thing, whatever Elliot had to say, it had the power to change everything. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for that.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to When We Collide. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 4, What Was Left Unsaid. The bridge looked exactly the same. A worn-out wooden railing, metal lamp posts casting soft golden light, and the faint sound of water rushing beneath. It was where they had spent so many nights in their youth, whispering secrets, dreaming of the future, and making promises they never kept. Lena stood at the edge, her fingers gripping the railing as she exhaled a slow, shaky breath. She had told herself 100 times today that she wasn't coming, that she should ignore his message and move on. Yet, here she was. Waiting. Her nerves buzzed as the familiar sound of footsteps echoed against the wooden planks behind her. She turned. Elliot stood there, hands in his pockets, a hesitant expression in his eyes. The dim light softened his features, making him look almost like the boy she had once loved, the boy who had held her hand on this very bridge and promised her forever. But forever had been broken. Hey, he said quietly. Lena nodded, gripping the railing tighter. Hey. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension was thick, heavy with all the words left unsaid. Elliot finally stepped closer, leaving only a few feet between them. Thanks for coming. I almost didn't, she admitted, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. I know, he said, his lips pressing into a thin line. But I needed to see you. There's something I never told you. Lena crossed her arms, bracing herself. Something besides the fact that you were sick? Elliot exhaled.
Yeah.
She didn't say anything, waiting. Elliot hesitated, his gaze dropping to the planks beneath their feet. Then, after a moment, he looked back up at her, his eyes filled with something raw. When I left, his voice faltered before he forced himself to continue. It wasn't just about me being sick. It was about you. Lena frowned. Me? Elliot nodded, stepping closer. Lena, I didn't just leave because I was scared of dying. I left because I was scared of ruining you. Lena's stomach twisted. What are you talking about? Elliot ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his movements. I saw what my illness was doing to my mom. She barely ate, barely slept. Every day was a fight to keep me alive, and every day, she lost a little more of herself. I didn't want that for you. I couldn't stand the thought of you putting your life on hold just to watch me fade away. Lena's heart pounded. So you thought disappearing would hurt me less? Elliot flinched. I thought it would be easier. I thought if you hated me, you'd move on faster. Lena stared at him, her chest tight. You don't get to decide how much I'm allowed to love you, Elliot. His breath hitched, and she could see the regret in his eyes. I know that now, he said, voice thick. I was wrong. I should have let you in. I should have let you choose. Lena swallowed hard. Yes. You should have. Silence stretched between them. The river murmured below, the only sound between their unspoken pain. Finally, Elliot took another step forward, voice softer now. Lena, I never stopped loving you. Her breath caught. I tried to bury it, he continued. Tried to pretend that staying away was for the best. But I never stopped thinking about you. Never stopped wanting to come back. Lena's eyes burned, but she refused to let herself cry. Then why didn't you? Elliot looked away for a moment before meeting her gaze again. Because I was ashamed. Because I was afraid I had broken something that couldn't be fixed. Lena let out a slow, shaky breath. Maybe you did. His expression flickered with pain, but he didn't look away. And if I did? If I broke us beyond repair? Lena clenched her jaw, torn between the memories of who they once were and the reality of who they had become. I don't know, Elliot, she admitted. I don't know. And that was the truth. Ghosts of the past. After the bridge, Lena walked home in a daze. She replayed the conversation over and over in her head, dissecting every word, every hesitation, every unspoken meaning. Elliot hadn't just been sick, he had been scared. Scared of hurting her, of being a burden, of letting her watch him waste away. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't enough to erase the pain of the last 5 years. But it was the truth. And now, she didn't know what to do with it. By the time she reached her apartment, her mind was exhausted. She had barely kicked off her shoes when her phone buzzed. Noah. She hesitated before answering. Hey. You okay? His voice was softer than usual. Lena sighed, collapsing onto the couch. I don't know. A pause. Then, did you meet him?
Yeah.
Noah didn't say anything at first, but she could hear him exhaling on the other end. And? Lena swallowed. And he told me why he left. The real reason. Noah's voice was careful. And do you believe him? She hesitated. Yes. Silence. Noah? His voice was quieter when he finally spoke. I don't want you to get hurt again, Lena. I know, she whispered. Another pause. Then, so what happens now? Lena closed her eyes. I don't know. Unfinished business. The days that followed were a blur. Lena threw herself into work, avoiding thoughts of Elliot as best as she could. But no matter how much she tried, he lingered. His voice. His words. The way his eyes had looked at her like she was still the most important thing in his world. Then, one evening, her phone buzzed again. Elliot. Elliot, I know I'm asking for a lot, but would you let me take you somewhere tomorrow? Just one night. No expectations. Just time. Lena stared at the message, her heart pounding. She could ignore it. Pretend she had already moved on. That it was too late for second chances. But deep down, she knew the truth. There were still things left unfinished between them. And if she didn't face them now, she might regret it forever. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she finally typed a response. "Lena, where?" His reply came almost instantly. "Elliot, it's a surprise. Pick you up at 7? Lena hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Lena, okay." As she set her phone down, a nervous flutter twisted in her stomach. For better or worse, tomorrow was going to change everything. The drive to the unknown. Lena had barely slept. After agreeing to meet Elliot, she had spent hours staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every memory of them together, both the good and the bad. By the time morning arrived, exhaustion clung to her, but so did a restless energy she couldn't shake. She stood by her apartment window, watching the world outside as the clock inched toward evening. When 7 p.m. finally arrived, a quiet knock on her door made her pulse jump. Taking a deep breath, she opened it. Elliot stood there, his hands in his jacket pockets, his expression cautious but warm. "You ready?" he asked. Lena hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding.
Yeah.
They walked to his car in silence. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of rain, making the air feel thick with something unspoken. As Elliot pulled onto the road, the city lights flickered past in a blur. Lena glanced at him, studying the way his fingers gripped the steering wheel, the way his jaw clenched slightly as if he was holding back a million thoughts. "Are you going to tell me where we're going?" she finally asked. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "It's somewhere we used to go all the time." Lena frowned, trying to think. "Somewhere from before?" Elliot nodded, but he didn't elaborate. She let the mystery hang between them, watching the road stretch ahead. Minutes passed, the silence between them surprisingly comfortable. It reminded her of the old days, when they used to drive around aimlessly, talking about everything and nothing. Except now, there were things that couldn't be ignored. The cabin by the lake. After an hour, Elliot turned onto a narrow road leading into the woods. Lena sat up straighter as memories rushed back. "No way," she murmured. Elliot glanced at her, a knowing smile on his lips. "Figured it out?" Lena shook her head in disbelief. "You still come here?" The cabin by the lake had been their secret hideaway in high school, a place where they escaped from the world, where they built bonfires and stayed up talking until sunrise. "I haven't been here in a long time," Elliot admitted as he pulled up to the clearing. "But I thought, maybe we could use a place away from everything." Lena stepped out of the car, inhaling deeply. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, just as she remembered. The lake stretched out beyond the trees, still and quiet, reflecting the sky like a dark mirror. Elliot walked toward the cabin and unlocked the door. Inside, dust covered the wooden furniture, but it still felt familiar. The old couch where they used to sit wrapped in blankets. The tiny kitchen where they had once tried, and failed, to cook dinner. Lena ran her fingers over the worn-out table, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Why did you bring me here, Elliot?" He leaned against the doorway, his eyes unreadable. "Because this is where we were us." Lena turned to him, her chest tightening. "We aren't the same people anymore." "I know," he said quietly. "But I needed to know if there's still anything left." Her breath caught. "And what if there isn't?" Elliot exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Then at least we'll know." Lena looked away, staring at the lake outside. It felt like she was standing at the edge of something terrifying. A past that still haunted her. A future she wasn't sure she was ready for. Finally, she turned back to him. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's find out." Confronting the past. They spent the evening outside, sitting on the cabin's wooden steps as the stars blinked to life above them. A small fire crackled in the fire pit, its glow casting flickering shadows over their faces. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, Elliot broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had stayed?" Lena's throat tightened. "All the time." Elliot stared into the fire. "Would you have stayed with me? Even after knowing everything?" Lena swallowed hard. "Yes." Elliot turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Even if it meant watching me get worse?" Her eyes burned. "It wouldn't have mattered. I would have rather had whatever time we had together than spend 5 years wondering why you left." Elliot sucked in a sharp breath. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Lena shook her head. "You weren't. But I don't think you ever meant to hurt me either." Elliot let out a bitter chuckle. "Then I failed in both ways." Lena hesitated before reaching for his hand. His fingers twitched, but he didn't pull away. "You were scared," she said softly. "I get it now." Elliot looked at her, something breaking in his gaze. "I should have let you in." Lena gave a small nod.
Yeah.
"You should have." For a long time, they just sat there, hands entwined, watching the flames flicker and dance. And for the first time in years, the past didn't feel like a weight crushing her. It felt like something she could finally face. What comes next? The night stretched on, but neither of them seemed eager to leave. At some point, they moved inside, settling onto the old couch. The tension between them had softened, replaced by something fragile but real. Elliot leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling. "Do you think we can fix this?" Lena's fingers traced patterns on the couch fabric. "I don't know." Elliot turned his head to look at her. "But do you want to?" Lena met his gaze, searching for her own answer. She wasn't sure if they could go back to what they once had. Too much had happened, too much had changed. But as she sat there beside him, she realized something. She still cared. Still loved him, in some way. And maybe that was enough to try. Taking a deep breath, she whispered, "I think I do." Elliot's fingers brushed against hers, hesitant but hopeful. "Then let's start there."
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to When We Collide. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 5, The Space Between Us. A New Beginning. The morning sun filtered through the trees as Lena and Elliot stood in the doorway of the cabin, the cool air filled with the scent of pine and earth. They had spent the night in silence, the kind of silence that spoke volumes, a silence that had bridged the gap between who they were and who they had yet to become. As the hours stretched, the weight of the past finally seemed to lift, leaving behind an uncertain but promising future. Elliot cleared his throat, breaking the stillness between them. "I was thinking," his voice was hesitant, as if testing the waters of their newfound connection. "Maybe we should talk about what happens next." Lena nodded slowly, feeling the gravity of his words. She had spent so long running from their past, unsure of whether she could ever open herself up to him again. But here, in this quiet place, she was beginning to realize that there was no easy answer, only the courage to take the next step forward, even if it meant facing the unknown. "What do you think should happen next?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot met her gaze with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I think," he paused, as if weighing his next words. "I think we need to give this a chance. Whatever this is." Lena's heart raced at the thought. A chance. A chance at what? At redemption? At healing? Or was it simply the possibility of finding a way back to each other? I'm not asking for anything more than that, he continued, his eyes softening. Just a chance to see where we go from here. Lena took a deep breath. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she didn't pull away. I'm scared, Elliot. He smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. So am I. The vulnerability between them felt almost palpable, but in a way that was different from the tension of the past. It was raw, open, and full of possibility. Lena's mind raced. The years of distance, of resentment and heartbreak, had carved deep scars. Yet, as she stood there, facing the man who had once been her everything, those scars felt less like walls and more like reminders. Reminders of what they had been and, perhaps, what they could be again. She let out a shaky breath, her fingers brushing against his. Okay, she said softly. Let's see where this goes. Elliot's face lit up with a mix of relief and something more, a glimmer of hope that had been buried beneath years of guilt and regret. He gently pulled her into a hug, and for a moment, Lena allowed herself to lean into him, feeling the warmth of his embrace wrap around her like a shield. They stood like that for a few moments, just breathing each other in, as if they were both trying to absorb everything they had missed. The return to reality. By the time they left the cabin and drove back to the city, the world around them felt different. The noise of traffic, the rush of everyday life, it all seemed distant, as though they had returned from some dreamlike place where time stood still. But as the reality of their situation began to settle in, so did the weight of what lay ahead. Lena glanced out the window, lost in thought. The city seemed to stretch endlessly before them, full of people who would never know what they had just shared, what they were beginning to rebuild. So, she said quietly, breaking the silence. What happens when we get back to normal life? Elliot glanced at her before returning his eyes to the road. Normal, he repeated, his voice tinged with a smile. I don't think either of us knows what normal is anymore. Lena chuckled softly, but it was a hollow sound, one that echoed her own uncertainty. Maybe we don't need to know, she said after a moment. Maybe we just need to be. Elliot turned to her, his expression serious. And if we're not enough? If it's not enough? She looked at him, her heart beating faster. Then we deal with that too. There was a pause as he absorbed her words. Then, he nodded, his face softening.
Yeah.
We deal with that too. The remainder of the drive was quieter, filled with the kind of unspoken understanding that only comes after confronting deep truths. They weren't perfect, and the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. But as they drove side by side, Lena felt the first spark of belief that maybe, just maybe, they could figure this out. The first step toward healing. When they finally reached Lena's apartment, the evening had already settled in. The golden glow of the setting sun painted everything in hues of pink and orange, casting a peaceful warmth across the world. Lena hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. She glanced at Elliot, who was already looking at her, waiting. I don't know what tomorrow looks like, she said, her voice low. Elliot smiled faintly, stepping closer. I don't either. But I think that's okay. For the first time in a long while, Lena didn't feel like she was standing at the edge of something broken. She felt, for the first time, that she was at the beginning of something new. I'll see you tomorrow, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elliot's smile deepened.
Yeah.
I'll be here. Lena stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and for the first time in years, she kissed him. It wasn't desperate or filled with passion. It was a quiet, lingering kiss, one that spoke of second chances and shared history, of healing and moving forward. When they pulled away, they didn't need words. The future was uncertain, but they were facing it together. And maybe that was enough. The path forward. The days following that night seemed to pass in a blur for Lena. The kiss, simple but profound, lingered in her thoughts, filling her with an unexpected warmth. She had never imagined that she would be here, standing on the precipice of something new with Elliot. Everything between them had been so complicated, so fractured. But somehow, with each passing day, things felt different, like they were slowly rebuilding what they had lost. Work became a familiar routine. The phone calls, the emails, the deadlines, they were all still there. But the space she shared with Elliot was becoming more constant. Each time they spoke or met, there was a subtle change in the air between them, a shift towards something real, something meaningful. It wasn't perfect. Far from it. There were still moments of doubt, moments where she wondered if they were rushing into something they weren't truly ready for. But there was also something else, something that pushed through her fears. It was a quiet certainty, a whisper telling her that maybe they could do this, whatever this was. An unexpected confession. It was a Friday evening when Elliot asked her to meet him at a small cafe they used to frequent during their college days. The request was simple enough, but there was something in his voice that made her heart beat a little faster. As she entered the cafe, she spotted him sitting by the window, staring out at the bustling street, lost in thought. When he saw her, a smile tugged at the corner of his lips, but there was an intensity in his eyes, something more than just the usual familiarity between them. "Hey," Lena said softly, sliding into the seat across from him. "You okay?" Elliot nodded but didn't immediately speak. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Lena waited, sensing that something was coming, something important. Finally, he exhaled deeply, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low. Lena's stomach fluttered with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. "What's going on?" Elliot's eyes met hers, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as though he was weighing the words in his mind. Then, with a quiet resolve, he spoke. "I've been afraid, Lena," he confessed, his voice shaky. "Afraid of what we might become, or if we could ever become anything again." Lena's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to be so vulnerable. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her coffee cup, but she didn't break eye contact. She needed to hear this. Needed him to say it out loud. "I thought I could just walk away," he continued, his voice rough. "That maybe it was better that way. That we were better off apart." He paused, swallowing hard. "But every time I tried to move on, to forget, I realized I couldn't. I couldn't forget you. And I couldn't stop wondering if you still felt the same." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had always wondered whether he regretted leaving, whether he felt the same emptiness she did. But hearing him say it out loud hit her in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I've been holding on to so much fear, Lena," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for how I left you. For how I let us slip away." His eyes were earnest, his guilt raw. "But I can't pretend anymore that I don't want to try. I want to try again, Lena. I want to build something with you." Her eyes welled with emotion, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She had been so scared to hope again, so afraid that even trying would lead to more heartbreak. But Elliot's confession cracked something inside her, a barrier she hadn't even realized was still up. "I don't know if I can just forgive everything right away," Lena admitted, her voice shaking with the intensity of her feelings. "But I do want to try, Elliot. I want to see if we can build something out of all the wreckage." Elliot's face softened, and he reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers. "We can start over. It won't be easy, but we can start fresh. And I promise, Lena, I'll be here. Every step of the way." Lena nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't have all the answers, didn't know how everything would turn out, but for the first time in years, she felt the possibility of something more, something worth fighting for. Taking a step forward. The next few weeks passed by in a blur of small, tentative steps. Lena and Elliot spent more time together, testing the waters of their new dynamic. There were awkward moments, times when the conversation faltered, and the past threatened to rise up again. But there were also moments of joy, quiet evenings where they would laugh over old memories or share their dreams for the future. The most difficult part was facing the people in their lives, those who had witnessed their breakup, who had been there during the painful months that followed. But as Lena and Elliot rebuilt their trust, they slowly began to rebuild the connections that had once felt lost. They introduced each other to their new friends, integrated each other into their lives in a way that felt natural, even though the wounds of the past still lingered. One evening, as they sat together on Lena's couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching a movie they both loved, Elliot spoke again. "You know," he said softly, "I never imagined we'd end up here. Not like this." Lena smiled, her fingers tracing the edge of his hand. "I didn't either. But I think I'm glad we did." Elliot turned to her, his expression serious. "I'm sorry for making you wait. For making you doubt me." Lena shook her head, her heart full. "You don't need to apologize anymore. We're here, Elliot. That's what matters." And for the first time in a long time, Lena realized that maybe, just maybe, they were both ready to leave the past behind. Ready to face the future, not as two broken people, but as two people willing to fight for what they had found in each other. The future they'd build. Months passed, and the world outside seemed to shift along with their growing connection. What had once been a broken, fractured love was now a slow, steady process of healing. They went on trips together, attended family gatherings, and supported each other through the highs and lows of life. They weren't perfect. They still had their struggles, still faced moments of doubt. But through it all, Lena and Elliot found something they hadn't had before, an understanding, a mutual respect, and a willingness to face whatever came their way together. Lena had learned to trust again. To hope. And in the end, it was that trust, that willingness to believe in something greater, that allowed them to build a love that had once seemed impossible. When they stood together, side by side, looking out at the future they had yet to create, Lena knew one thing for certain: no matter what came their way, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The end.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Thank you for listening to Akumah Audiobooks. For more stories like this, check out channel playlist and keep up with the weekly updates by subscribing.